Welcome back, dreamer. You've arrived at DrowsyTeller, where the noise of the day fades into hush and stories unfold like moonlight on quiet streets. If it's your first time here, we're so glad you've found us. And if you've been here before, thank you for returning to this gentle space. As always, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, or share a word in the comments if these nighttime stories bring you peace. Your presence here means more than you know. Tonight, we invite you into something tender, a soft moment pulled from an ordinary day, yet wrapped in the glow of something timeless. A woman, a stranger, a small act of kindness between two people drifting through the same hour. This is a story about warmth, about eye contact that lingers a moment longer than it should, about quiet understanding when words feel unnecessary, and about how sometimes the most fleeting encounters are the ones that stay with us longest. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, let the weight of everything else fall away, breathe in, let go. And now, close your eyes if you like, it's time to begin. Operation Northwoods, the case that killed Kennedy. If you're hearing this, something went wrong. I don't record myself often, not like this, but if they find the files I've been working on, if they make me vanish, I want someone to know I didn't disappear because I cracked. I was careful. I was deliberate. And I didn't imagine any of this. It started 8 days ago with an envelope. There was no knock, no signature required, just a plain, off-white envelope in my mailbox, buried between a pizza flyer and a utility bill. No return address, no postage, no handwriting. Inside was a USB drive. Black, scratched, anonymous. I plugged it in before I had time to overthink it, my laptop humming softly as the system mounted it. One folder, one document inside, a PDF. No encryption, no password. Just a name. Northwoods Document 1. At first, I assumed it was junk. Something scraped from a conspiracy subreddit or uploaded by a bored teenager. The title screen looked like a photocopy. Department of Defense, Memorandum for the Secretary of Defense. It was dated March 13, 1962. Operation Northwoods. I'd heard the name in passing, mostly from men who spoke too loudly in diners and wore shirts 2 sizes too big, but I kept reading. By the time I reached the 3rd page, the skin on my forearms tightened. It wasn't a rant, it wasn't vague. It was a structured military proposal from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to create a series of false flag operations, real attacks, on American civilians, military targets, even commercial flights, to drum up public support for a war with Cuba. One line stood out: "We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington." The language was cold, measured, professional. They proposed fabricating passenger deaths by replacing a real civilian aircraft with a drone. Simulate a crash. Blame Cuba. And that wasn't even the most disturbing idea in the document. I sat back in my chair. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page, as if daring me to continue. The next paragraph detailed the possibility of using a fake funeral for American servicemen. No real bodies, just empty caskets, to provoke a public outcry. Another section casually mentioned sinking boats of Cuban refugees and attributing it to the Castro regime. Every scenario was listed with a military code and a potential psychological impact rating. I paused the recording for a few minutes after that, poured myself a drink, stared at the PDF open on my screen. Something about it felt too clean to be fake. So I did what I always do when something seems wrong. I called a friend at the NSA, someone I'd gone to school with, someone who owed me 2 favors and didn't ask too many questions. I told him I needed a document verified. He asked for a hash code. I gave it to him. He called back 3 hours later. His voice had changed. "It's real," he said. "Classified in '62. Declassified in 2001. Not many people noticed when it hit the archives. Most assumed it was Cold War paranoia. Why? I told him the file was just dropped in my mailbox. Silence. Then he said, "Be careful who you tell." That document didn't stay buried for 40 years by accident. The next morning, I woke up and reread the file line by line. I'd printed it out, 56 pages in all. The last few pages included the signatures. One name jumped out, Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. His initials were on every page. The file wasn't theory, it was policy, proposed, reviewed, and nearly executed. The only thing that stopped it was President Kennedy. He had rejected it outright, refused to let it move forward. Weeks later, Lemnitzer was reassigned, quietly, pushed out of the loop. But the document itself had survived. I began making voice notes like this one, cataloging everything I found. I copied the file onto 2 separate drives, stored them in separate places. I ran metadata analysis. Everything checked out. Even the scanned stamps matched DoD internal routing sheets from the early 60s. Whoever dropped this file in my mailbox knew what they were doing, and they knew I'd take the bait. I didn't sleep well that night. My mind kept circling the same question. If this operation was real, if the military truly plotted to murder Americans and pin the blame on a foreign government, what else did they propose? And why did someone want me to see it now? The document had no redactions, no missing pages. That struck me as strange. Every declassified file I've ever seen has at least one name blacked out, one paragraph withheld. This one was pristine. Either someone cleaned it, or someone had access to the original version before it went public. I checked my building's security cameras the next day. Nothing. No footage from the time I estimate the envelope arrived. The landlord said the system had looped over after a power surge. I checked the logs. The surge happened just before dawn, 2 hours before I found the envelope. Tonight, I started going through JFK's speeches from late 1961 through the spring of '62. There's a shift in tone. You can hear it. He begins emphasizing peace, reduction of nuclear threat, a resistance to escalation. He talks about covert action, about the danger of secrecy in a democracy. There's a phrase he uses repeatedly. The very word secrecy is repugnant. And that's when it hit me. If he rejected Northwoods, if he blocked it, someone might have seen that as betrayal, a refusal to play by the rules. And when you don't play along with the game, sometimes the game plays you instead. I'm not drawing conclusions. Not yet. But I have questions. And if this was step 1 of some larger pattern, then I need to understand the rest before I go public. Because if this document really was meant to stay hidden, and someone went through the trouble to deliver it to me now, it means that someone wants me to see what happens next. I spent most of the next day in silence, the document still spread out across my desk like the aftermath of a dissection. The longer I stared at it, the more it felt like a blueprint, not just a file, a design for something we weren't supposed to know could even exist. But it wasn't until I opened the second file on the USB drive that I realized how deep this might go. There had been only one folder on the device when I first plugged it in. I would have sworn it. One folder, one document. But when I powered it on again the next morning, there were 2. The first was unchanged. The second had a simple name. Document number 2. Same formatting, same layout. But this one was dated 6 weeks later, late April 1962, and it wasn't addressed to the Secretary of Defense. It was labeled Eyes Only, Internal Strategy Review. It took less than a page for me to realize what I was looking at. This wasn't a formal proposal. This was an internal summary, a review of the Northwoods concept after Kennedy had rejected it. The tone was sharper, more urgent, as if whoever wrote it was venting frustration just beneath the surface. Phrases like executive miscalculation and failure to appreciate necessary sacrifices peppered the margins. It referred to the president only as CIC, Commander-in-Chief, and the notes were initialed by 3 different individuals, though their full names were never written out. One initial caught my eye. C, just a capital letter, nothing else. It appeared 4 times, next to some of the most aggressive annotations in the document. I cross-referenced the DoD org charts from that year, pulling up a list of every senior intelligence official whose name might fit. One possibility stood out: Curtis LeMay, General, Air Force. A man known for his bluntness, his temper, and his belief that America had become too soft. He'd once famously said we should bomb North Vietnam back into the Stone Age. It fit the tone. The document proposed modifications to the original Northwoods plan: smaller operations, scalable deception initiatives. That phrase stuck with me: scalable. It suggested a mindset that wasn't fixated on Cuba anymore, but on a system, something modular, transferable like software. The author referenced other geopolitical flashpoints where Northwoods-style tactics could be domestically effective. One passage mentioned civil aviation as a sensitive vector for narrative control, and another outlined the utility of public martyrdom and manufacturing consent. They were still talking about fake attacks, still entertaining ideas involving civilian casualties, but now there was a new component: media choreography. The document discussed the manipulation of news cycles, the pre-positioning of journalists, and the pre-written obituaries for fabricated victims. This wasn't just military theater. This was psychological architecture. I sat back, heart racing. I had seen government planning documents before. They were cold by nature, detached, technical. But this had emotion. The anger of someone who believed their vision had been betrayed, and the ambition of someone who wasn't finished. I ran a metadata extraction on the file. Hidden in the document properties was a single embedded reference. Not a name, not a date. A code. OPGTXF. I searched every archive I had access to. Public, private, even a few password-protected databases I wasn't supposed to know how to reach. Nothing. The only hit I got was a 4-line paragraph in an old Department of the Navy index file from 1977. The title had been redacted. The paragraph simply said, "Refer to OPGTXF protocols in case of executive noncompliance." I highlighted that line and stared at it for hours. By late afternoon, I had printed the second document and pinned it alongside the first on the corkboard behind my desk. I took photos of every page. Then I went back to the envelope. It had felt ordinary when I first opened it. A recycled stationery sleeve with a faint scent of tobacco and adhesive. But now I saw something I hadn't noticed. A small stamp embossed into the flap. Barely visible. A circle with a broken triangle inside it. I scanned it, enhanced it, ran it through a symbol recognition tool. The closest match I could find was the insignia of the Joint Communications Unit, a division of the Department of Defense that operated out of Fort Bragg. They handled signals intelligence, mostly black ops comms, the kind of people who didn't leave stamps. Someone wanted me to know they had access, not just to the documents, but to the tools that moved those documents without trace. Around 6 p.m., I went out to clear my head, walked 4 blocks to a bar I used to frequent back when I still believed in normal weekends. I ordered one drink, kept my back to the wall, and watched the door. Paranoia hadn't fully taken hold yet, but I could feel it circling. That night, I listened back to the recordings I'd made of my own voice, this voice, and heard something strange. A brief pop of static around the 33-minute mark on the first file. Then again at minute 41. I ran the waveform through my audio scrubber. There was a frequency spike. Short, deliberate, like a microtransmission. A watermark? A hidden track? I isolated it, played it at half speed. Buried in the noise was something that didn't belong, not digital, mechanical, rhythmic, like a relay switching. 3 clicks, pause, 2 more, then silence, not random. I pulled the USB stick from the drive and shut everything down. Something about this isn't digital at all. Someone wanted to be found, or followed. Either way, I'm not done. Not until I know who sent the envelope, and why they're sending me documents that were never meant to survive the 60s. The pattern wasn't linear, but it was tightening. 2 documents, 1 dead president, and a growing sense that I was opening drawers someone had padlocked a long time ago. I didn't touch the USB drive for 2 days, not because I was afraid of what was on it, but because I was afraid of what wasn't. Because if that was all they sent me, it meant the rest was up to me. And I'd need to go back to the place where the lie began. Dallas. I booked a flight under a different name, used a prepaid card. The kind you buy at gas stations, the kind that doesn't leave much of a trail. No laptop, no phone. I brought a small audio recorder, 3 notebooks, and a paperback novel to keep up appearances. It felt excessive, but I wasn't being careful for show. I hadn't been sleeping well. I'd wake at 3 or 4 a.m. with the feeling that someone was in the hallway, not moving, just listening. No footsteps, no voices, just wait. I landed in Texas just after sunrise. The airport was clean, quiet, artificial. I rented a car, cash deposit, no questions, and drove straight to Dealey Plaza. I'd seen the photos 100 times, the Zapruder film, the grassy knoll, the triple underpass. But standing there, it felt too small, like a stage, a perfectly sized theater for a perfectly framed tragedy. Every angle I turned my head, there was a camera shot I recognized, grainy, handheld, frozen in time. I stood across from the old Texas school book depository, where Oswald allegedly fired 3 shots. 6th floor, window open, no scope glare, no casing flash, just 3 bullets and a ghost story. But what caught my eye wasn't the window. It was the street below. There were marks on the pavement, faded but still visible. X's, I'd read the stories. Local tour guides repainted them from time to time. One marked the location of the fatal shot. A second marked the throat hit. I knelt beside one, pressed my fingers to the asphalt. Warm. Real. The spot where history tore. A man stood watching me. Mid-60s, pressed shirt, Veterans of Foreign Wars cap. He didn't speak, just nodded once, slow, as if acknowledging a ceremony neither of us had names for. I followed the motorcade route on foot, down Elm, under the underpass, into the shadowed curve where the car accelerated after the shots. I walked it all in silence, no headphones, no recordings. Just wind and bloodstains long since washed away. At a small museum inside the depository building, I lingered by a glass case labeled Alternative Theories. It felt like a joke, a sanitized box of shadows, models, bullet trajectories, speculative newspaper clippings. But something caught my attention. A single sentence on a panel near the back. Some documents related to military contingency planning from 1962 remain classified. I asked the desk attendant where they got that phrasing. She didn't know. Said it had been there for years. I wrote it down anyway. That night, I checked into a motel outside of town. Cheap, anonymous, forgettable. I set up the audio recorder and started going through my field notes. One passage from the second document was looping in my head. In the absence of sanctioned justification, executive-targeted destabilization may become operationally favorable. At the time, I hadn't thought of it as literal, but standing in Dealey Plaza, feeling the geometry of that space, the perfect angles, the narrowed lanes, the sight lines from multiple positions, it felt too deliberate. I went back over the Secret Service assignments from that day, November 22nd, 1963. They'd received an updated route map the night before. The change came from within the Dallas Police Department, but it had been signed off by someone in the White House detail. A name I'd never seen before, H. Drenner. That name didn't exist in any of the formal rosters. I pulled out my notebook and started drawing. The route, the knoll, the depository, the shadows. Then I overlaid it on a map of Dealey Plaza from 1962. Same buildings, same vantage points. No coincidences. Before midnight, I made a call to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Graham Vickers, former Army intelligence, now teaching political history in upstate New York. He owed me a favor. I asked him one question. When you hear the words executive-targeted destabilization, what comes to mind? There was a pause. Long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then, who's asking? I gave him the name I was using for the trip. He didn't ask why. That phrase wasn't used in formal doctrine, he said slowly, but it floated around in compartmental memos, mostly black cell strategy meetings. Nothing ever on paper, not officially. So, what does it mean? I asked. Another pause. It means removing a head of state without pulling a trigger yourself. You destabilize them, you isolate them, and if necessary, you engineer inevitability. He hung up. I sat with that word, inevitability. In my notes, I circled it 6 times. At 4 a.m., I walked to the vending machine outside the motel. As I stepped back inside, I noticed the desk drawer in my room was slightly open. I hadn't left it that way. Inside, the Gideon Bible was gone. In its place was a folded sheet of paper. Typed, narrow margin, courier font. Northwoods was only a model. Models evolve. Stay out of the frame. I didn't sleep. I recorded this instead. I left Dallas before dawn. The message in the drawer made it clear my presence wasn't just noticed. It was anticipated. Whoever had written it hadn't threatened me. Not directly, but the phrase, "stay out of the frame," stuck to the inside of my skull like a splinter under the fingernail. It didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a test, a way of measuring what I'd do next. I drove east for hours. No GPS, no cards, just highways and gas stations that still used mechanical pumps. I ended up back in D.C. By the end of the week, tired, raw, but wired with a kind of direction I hadn't felt since this started. I knew what I needed next. Not speculation, not fragments. Names, orders, signatures. There's a facility on the edge of Maryland. Federal Records Center. Quiet place. Nothing like the National Archives downtown. No school trips, no tours, no glass walls. Just rows of long gray buildings surrounded by perimeter fencing, cameras, and the kind of silence that hums inside your ears after you've been there too long. I made an appointment using one of my old press credentials. Said I was researching Cold War contingency logistics. No one blinked. The clerk at the check-in desk was bored, chewing gum like it owed him money. He stamped my access slip and pointed me toward a rear wing labeled D Block. I expected long halls and more locked doors. What I found instead was a woman standing alone beside a rolling cart filled with manila folders. Her ID tag was flipped around, but her demeanor told me everything. She wasn't a receptionist. She wasn't just filing. She was watching me the moment I walked in, not with suspicion, but with focus. Like she'd been waiting. She gestured to the table without speaking. On it were 3 files, already pulled. The first was labeled JCS-Cub CIVSIMUL-Test MEM-62. The second, OPCOMM-Media Response/Pre-Delivery 62Q2. The third was different, unmarked, rubber-banded twice, a handwritten note tucked beneath it. This copy never left the building. She didn't introduce herself, didn't explain the files. She simply said, "You'll have 30 minutes. I'll stay here." The first file was a summary of simulations conducted by Joint Chiefs analysts in early spring of '62. They'd built a full-scale behavioral model, civilian panic response, media spin cycles, Allied reaction scenarios, for a fabricated terrorist attack on Miami public transit. It detailed how quickly chaos could be converted into political will. Key phrase, projected morning cycle, 72 hours before majority backs escalation. I stopped, reread it. Not only had they plotted an event, they had calculated public grief like a marketing team. The second file broke me open. It included a draft of news copy written weeks before any action had even been proposed. Pre-approved headlines, suggested anchors, quotes from fictional family members. One sheet contained a script for a televised funeral of 3 schoolchildren killed in a Cuban bombing. Dates, names, church location, even a priest's quote, "We must not let their deaths be in vain." I turned the page and found a memo labeled Distribution Protocol. It outlined coordination points between military public affairs and major media affiliates. Several of the networks were blacked out. Thick, ugly strokes of redaction. But one wasn't. National Broadcasting Corporation, Live Feed Contingency Desk. The archivist saw me staring and finally spoke. "That memo wasn't meant to be kept," she said. Her voice was low, deliberate. "It was part of a destruction batch, missed the deadline." I asked her why she showed me. She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the answer. "I don't believe in ghosts," she said. "But some paper, it haunts." The third file was thinner, more fragile. Carbon copies. Typewriter bleed. Real paper. Not scanned, not digital. Inside were notes from a closed-door session of the National Security Council, dated 1 week after Northwoods was formally rejected. The header was incomplete, no clear title, but the notes were intact. One line was underlined twice in pen. "Executive blockage necessitates alternate operational path. Contingency code to be revised under Project 3 Dogs." 3 Dogs. I'd never heard the term before. I tried not to react, but the archivist caught the way I stiffened. She nodded once, like a secret handshake had just been performed without words. She pulled a small slip of paper from her sleeve and handed it to me under the table. "You didn't see this here," she said. It was a location. Basement level. Secondary reading room, room 17. She turned her back and returned to her cart. I followed the hall, past silent elevators and file drawers labeled with decades like tombstones. Room 17 had no number on the door, just a keycard reader and a red light. When I swiped the slip of paper through the reader, it turned green. Inside, the lights flickered on slowly. It was a room with no windows and too much dust. A microfilm machine sat in the center, humming faintly. One reel was already loaded. The screen glowed with a single title frame. Transcript number 1, Operation 3 Dogs Briefing, April 17, 1962. The voice was faint, distant, male, possibly Southern. Hard to pinpoint. If executive decision-making cannot support strategic deception, then we must explore other routes. This nation is not a democracy in spirit. It is a narrative machine. If the operator fails to input the proper commands, the system must be rerouted. I played it again. Same words, same cadence. The phrasing didn't sound like a general. It sounded like a technician describing a system failure. The screen flicked to a new slide. Stage 1, removal of inhibiting nodes. And then the machine stopped. Power gone, entire room silent. I heard a soft knock from outside the door. 3 taps, pause, 2 more. Same pattern as the static pulse I'd found in my audio. I packed my notes and walked out without looking back. I haven't gone home since Maryland. The apartment feels compromised now. Too static, too quiet, like something in it's already been turned off. I've been rotating through short-term rentals, motels with carpet that still smells like the 80s, and rooms where the only locks that matter are the ones I bring myself. Every night before sleep, I tape a strip of hair-thin paper across the door frame. If it tears by morning, I don't ask questions, I just move on. Today, I went to the Hill, not the symbolic one. Not the Capitol dome or any gleaming marble facade meant for postcards. I mean the Hill. Dealey's Knoll, again. I wasn't going back for sentiment. I had questions, and a new thread to pull. 3 dogs, the contingency name from the transcript. It wasn't a term used in any military operation I could find in open records, but buried in a little-known anthology of declassified Senate transcripts from the late 70s, I found a single mention. Committee on Intelligence Oversight. 1 entry, no author, just a reference. Discussion redacted per 3 dogs control flag. Origin. SecNav, JCS briefing notes, spring 62. There it was again. Spring of 62, same timing, same context. I made a list, a timeline. JFK rejects Northwoods in mid-March. 3 dogs appears in April. Within days, internal planning documents shift from overt action to something coded, modular, behavioral. Not battlefield operations, executive environment recalibration. I stood on the knoll again, early morning this time, before the reenactors, before the kids on rented scooters pretending to care. There's a plaque now, bronze, fixed into the ground at an angle where the sun reflects off it at just the right hour. It says nothing of consequence, just a commemoration. But near it, a local man was setting up folding chairs and a little sandwich board for a walking tour. His voice was rough. South Texas, or maybe Louisiana. He spoke slowly, as if reading from inside his own memory. I listened for a while. Then I asked him a question. Did they ever find bullet fragments on the north face of the pergola? He looked at me and grinned without warmth. They found things, he said. Whether they logged them is another story. He introduced himself as Cal, former Marine. Claimed he'd done crowd control during the motorcade. I doubted it, but I let him talk. You know where you're standing? He asked. I nodded. He pointed past the fence line. You're not just on the knoll. You're standing right over the old switch access. I asked him what that meant. City used to run service cables through here. Emergency audio lines, underground comms, back when they thought the Russians would nuke every phone tower. My cousin did maintenance on them. Swore there was a patch job done right after the shooting, like someone dug in quick and buried something new. I offered him cash for details. He took it and gave me an address. It was a little records office northeast of downtown. Municipal Utilities Archive, not secure, not federal, just old. The kind of place that still ran on punch card filing and smelled like asbestos dust and heat. The clerk there didn't care who I was. I showed her a fake letter of research purpose, and she wheeled out a cart with microfilm from city maintenance logs dated 1963. Most reels were boring. Sewer relining, faulty traffic lights, but one entry, dated November 25th, 3 days after the assassination, showed a work order request marked expedited by direction. No agency code, just initials, LD. The request was for cable trench seal and forward signal tap decommission, coordinates placing it directly under the knoll. I pulled the blueprint. It showed a tunnel, no more than 6 feet deep, 2 access hatches, one of which opened directly behind the wooden picket fence tourists now posed in front of for selfies. The structure had been collapsed in early December, just 2 weeks after the request. I took photos of the logs, left a $10 bill in the donation jar, and drove back to the hill. There's a bench near the top curve, just under a line of trees that frame the kill zone like a proscenium arch. I sat there for an hour, watching the wind, the angles, the unnatural symmetry of the space. From that bench, you can see the depository, the street curve, and the fence. The triangle of visibility, 3 dogs, 3 points, 3 lines of sight. I checked the time, exactly 1:42 p.m. That's when the shot was supposed to have hit the president's head. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the sound. Not the rifle. The silence just before it. Because someone knew exactly what would happen in that pause. On my way out of the plaza, I noticed something else. A man I'd seen earlier in the morning, same ball cap, same coffee cup, sitting in the same spot. Not filming, not reading, just waiting. And the third time I passed him, he looked up and tapped the rim of his cup twice. Not a greeting. A signal. Same pattern as before. 3 taps. Pause. 2. I kept walking, but I recorded this the moment I reached my car, because I think I'm starting to understand what 3 dogs really meant. I didn't go home. I didn't go to the safe house either. I drove through the night until the road stopped making sense, turned off the main highway, and found a place that didn't exist on any map app. One of those towns that lives between cell towers, where cash is still king, and strangers are noticed. I paid in bills, signed no name, and took a second-floor room facing the parking lot. Curtains drawn, voice low. I spent most of the night with the documents spread out across the mattress. The map of the plaza, the blueprint of the trench, the list of post-assassination repair orders. The pattern was tightening. Everything pointed back to the same window of time, the weeks after JFK shut down Northwoods and the weeks before his motorcade rolled through Dallas. That overlap was where the thread had to snap. I started digging for names of those in the room when Northwoods was pitched, names of those who signed the briefing notes on 3 dogs. Most were familiar: committee heads, security advisors, military brass. But one name kept disappearing. Not redacted, absent, like someone had been deliberately removed from the table. In an Air Force memo about operational options in Cuba, dated March of '62, a name appears in the routing chain. Major General H.L. Keene. 2 weeks later, in an updated chain, Keene is gone, replaced by an acting deputy, no reason given. His name doesn't appear in any promotion records, retirement announcements, or obituaries. The personnel ledger just ends. I ran his name through the Defense Manpower Data Center. No match, no service number, as if he had never existed. But the memo was real. I cross-checked the routing code. Same format, same signatures. Someone had manually removed Keene from history, but forgot to erase the footprints. At 10 the next morning, I received a call from a number with no origin point. Just the words, "out of area," on the screen. I didn't answer. 30 seconds later, a voicemail came through. It was 3 seconds of silence, then a single sentence in a clipped synthetic voice. He was promoted laterally and buried administratively. No ID, no callback option. I ran the audio through a filter. There were layers beneath it. A digital watermark. It resolved to a string of numbers I'd seen before. OPGTXF. The same phantom code from the document number 2. The phrase, buried administratively, echoed. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a term used in compartmentalized programs to describe personnel who had been reassigned into black projects, units so deep that not even their paychecks were processed through standard channels. People like that don't retire. They vanish in plain sight. I took a calculated risk and made contact with someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Noah Clark. Used to work signals and analysis at Fort Meade. Burned out, dropped off the radar. Last I heard, he was doing freelance encryption audits in Phoenix. I found him. He still had the same old burner address. I told him I needed intel on a lateral promotion file buried in a dead base. He sent one line back. There's only one place you'd hide a general who shouldn't exist. Site 12, Nevada. That stopped me cold. Site 12 was one of those names that didn't show up in FOIA indexes. Not a real base, not officially. It was rumored to be an annex of Nellis, hidden under a private contractor shell company that changed every fiscal quarter. Not Area 51, too obvious, too public. Site 12 was something else, a holding pattern for ghosts. I asked Clark if he could confirm whether Keene ever worked there. He didn't respond for 2 hours. Then I got a text with an image, a fragment of a scanned access log. Blurry, cropped, barely legible, but the column heading was clear. Entry, Major General H.L. Keene, Level 4. Protocol, April 5, 1962. A name that didn't exist, entering a facility that wasn't real, exactly 2 weeks after Northwoods was shut down. I printed the image, folded it into my notebook, and started packing. Then I found something else. Among the notes I'd copied from the microfilm session in the basement at the archives, the transcript labeled 3 Dogs Briefing. I missed a line in the speaker's closing statement. I was too focused on the language, too caught up in the tone, but now I saw it. Barely legible, but there. Execute per Keene iteration, package messaging post-justification window. They hadn't buried Keene, they'd used him. He wasn't the planner, he was the model. A human node inside a system designed to adapt when democracy said no. I started recording this entry immediately. Because I'm going west. It started with the radio, somewhere near the Arizona border, in a rental car under a false name, windows down, desert air cutting through like broken glass. The radio turned itself on. Not the stereo, not Bluetooth, the old analog tuner, the kind that still clicks when you twist the dial. I hadn't touched it. It clicked, buzzed, and landed on an empty band. White noise. Then, just beneath it, a voice, mechanical, low, almost whispering, counting numbers. 4, 6, 9. Pause. 2, 1, repeat. A numbers station. I hadn't heard one in years, not real ones, not local. This wasn't bouncing off shortwave from Eastern Europe or Cuba. This was nearby. I pulled off the road, shut off the engine. The sound was gone. That was my introduction to Site 12. Not directly, not physically. But from the moment I crossed into Nevada, the rules changed. The same rental car I picked up in Phoenix suddenly had no matching entry in the return system. My card, prepaid and wiped clean, now showed a $1 charge from a gas station I never visited. My phone, turned off, battery removed, stored in a Faraday pouch, pinged itself once on a tower labeled Restricted N12. That shouldn't have been possible. This wasn't surveillance. It was proximity. I kept driving north through nothing. Long stretches of burnt scrub, roads that existed in theory more than practice, until I reached a forgotten town called Mina. One diner, one motel, one bar that didn't have a name, just a sign that said, "Open when possible." I parked behind the motel, checked in under the name Henry Morris, and paid for 2 nights. The clerk didn't ask questions, didn't make eye contact, just slid a key across the counter like he'd done it 10,000 times for ghosts just like me. That night, I played back all 6 of my previous recordings. I needed to hear it all in sequence. Not just facts, but tone, rhythm, cadence, the voice I used when I thought I was still in control. By the time I reached the end of the last file, the one where I said, "I'm going west," I realized I'd used a phrase I'd heard before: package messaging, post justification window. I'd thought it was bureaucratic filler, buried in the Three Dogs transcript, but now it echoed with purpose. Someone had written that sentence knowing it would be spoken aloud, repeated, recorded, like an activation phrase without a target. A linguistic landmine. Once said, it couldn't be unsaid. I left the recorder running and went out for a walk. The air was brittle, moonless. I counted my steps. On the 33rd step, a man passed me. Didn't look, didn't slow down, just said, "Interference starts at window 3. No context, no follow-up. I kept walking. The next morning, my laptop wouldn't boot. Brand new hard drive. Cold dead screen. When I opened it up, I found a single hairline scratch across the motherboard. Not from wear, not from damage. Deliberate. A cut clean enough to be surgical. I went to the diner, ordered eggs. The waitress handed me a paper receipt without taking my payment. I looked at it. There was no charge, just a note scribbled in blue pen. "You are not the first to listen to Keen." I left without the food. Back in my room, I powered up the backup recorder, the analog one, the one with no wireless components. I played back every note I had on Keen. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. Every time I mentioned his name, the audio waveform shifted, ever so slightly, as if something were embedded behind my own voice. I ran a frequency scrub. There it was, below the decibel floor, nonverbal data, timestamps. The pattern lined up with the number station broadcast from 2 days before. Keen wasn't just a person. He was a carrier, a template. I played the last known audio of his voice, a fragment extracted from a training reel dated spring '62, grainy, low fidelity. But there was a sentence buried in static that I heard now with a different ear. An operator must be blind to the mechanism. That's the only way the pattern holds. Not a threat, not a confession, a system design note. I left Mina that night. Left the recorder running as I drove. I think the pattern is breaking. Not because I'm close to the truth, but because I was never outside of it. The sun hadn't come up yet when I crossed into California. No lights, no signs, just the hum of tires on unfinished road and the dull awareness that I was being monitored in a way I couldn't measure. Not watched, sampled, like a sensor scraping data from my thoughts. I parked behind an industrial park outside Barstow and pulled out the envelope I'd sealed 3 days earlier. Inside were 2 drives, 3 copies of the most sensitive files, and a single handwritten note addressed to whom it may concern. I had intended to mail it anonymously from 3 different cities. I never made it past the first post office. When I stepped inside, I found the clerk waiting. Not just at the desk, waiting. His gaze landed on me the second I crossed the threshold. There were no other customers, no background noise. The radio behind the counter was playing something that wasn't music, a continuous tone, too high to register clearly, but low enough to feel. I placed the envelope on the counter. He didn't touch it, just looked at me, then said, "You're carrying a contaminated signal." I didn't speak, didn't move. He continued, "They won't let you release it." "Not that way." I asked him who they were. He reached beneath the counter and slid a small slip of paper toward me. A blank receipt except for a single typed line. Containment activated under OPGTXF. External publishing blocked. Internal retention authorized. I walked out without mailing the envelope. Back in the car, I tried again, this time uploading the files through a VPN to a secure drop at the intercept. Connection failed. I tried again, a second route, this time via 2 nodes in Reykjavik and Brussels. Same result. Timeout. Third attempt, routed through a Tor bridge used by whistleblowers. The upload progressed to 97%, then hung. Not failed, just suspended, as if something was letting it reach the edge before clamping shut. I checked the diagnostics. The local network was clean. My laptop was isolated. Still, the signal was being caught before it left me. That's when I realized it wasn't about blocking the data. It was about watching who tried. I pulled the Ethernet, killed the power, buried the drives in the desert that night inside a discarded metal junction box 6 miles from the main road. I left no markers, didn't even write down the coordinates. If I need them, I'll remember. I checked into a trucker motel under the name Paul Green, room on the 2nd floor, a C broken. 1 outlet worked. I left the recorder running, letting it pick up the ambient silence. At some point near midnight, I heard my voice. Not live, not from outside. A playback, 3 seconds, 1 line. "This is the last thing I'll ever say." Then, static. The recorder showed no playback history. I reviewed every file. My previous entries were intact, but now, buried in the file labeled 7, was a new sublayer. Hidden in the noise floor, time-stamped 15 seconds after I stopped speaking. I ran a full decryption. Inside it, a string of text. XF acknowledgement confirmed. Containment protocol. Spiral trigger primed. Do not release. That wasn't a file error. That was a planted directive. A message inserted after the file had already been archived. It meant someone, or something, had access to my voice chain in real time. At 4 a.m., I walked into a 24-hour print shop and paid cash to use their public terminal. I typed out a brief summary of what I'd found. Nothing detailed, just a breadcrumb trail. 3 paragraphs, vague but alarming. I printed 1 copy, folded it twice, left it inside the sleeve of a paperback novel in the waiting area. The book was Fahrenheit 451. No symbolism intended. Just the first title I saw. As I left, the clerk handed me a receipt, even though I hadn't asked. The timestamp was wrong. It read, November 22nd, 1963. I didn't go back inside. I drove east. I needed to finish this recording before I go completely dark for a while. I'm compiling everything I have, the audio, the files, the symbols, the voices, the activation sequences, and storing them on a new device. Physical only. No online access. If you're hearing this, then either I failed and someone else found it, or I was successful. And that's why you're next. There are places in the desert where even silence hums. It's not wind, not wildlife, just the steady pressure of absence, like the land is remembering something it was forced to forget. I've been here for 3 days. No name on the map, no clear path in or out. Just sand-colored stone and sky that feels like a closed lid. The roads stopped existing miles ago, and the path I'm following now isn't on any GPS. It came from a piece of notebook paper, handwritten, folded into the lining of my jacket. I don't remember putting it there. On it, 6 words. Keen didn't vanish. He completed integration. I've been playing the last 8 recordings on loop through an isolated player, analog only. No network interface, no wireless chip. Still, last night, something answered. Not a voice, not speech, a return frequency. Buried in the hiss, a pulse. Regular, biological, not mechanical. 5 beats. Pause, 3, repeat. I recorded it, played it backward, then again at half speed. Beneath the rhythm was a phrase, modulated and sharp. The machine was meant to forget. You made it remember. I woke up just after midnight. A high-pitched tone in my ear, the kind that shouldn't have a source. I stumbled out of the tent, stood under the stars, no movement, no light, but on the ridgeline, the faintest outline of a figure. Still, upright, watching. I called out. No reply. I approached, but it dissolved into the terrain like a burn mark fading into ash. When I returned to camp, my notebook was open, a page torn out. On the inside of the cover, a name was written, one I hadn't seen before. Column Arden G. Weil. I ran it through every index I had offline. Nothing. Not military, not civilian. But when I scanned the metadata from the microfilm I'd smuggled out of the archive, I found the name encoded once, buried in the margins of a maintenance transcript from Site 12. Weil was listed as Observer Liaison, XF Core Simulation. He wasn't just part of the operation. He watched it run. I decoded the rest of the line. It included a phrase I'd come to hate. Spiral logic, recursive disinformation injection successful. Keen wasn't the only template. He was the first. I found a dry ravine near the southern ridge and dug out the junction box I'd buried. The drives were intact. I powered one up using a shielded tablet, completely air-gapped. No signal, no ports open. As it booted, a folder appeared, one that didn't exist before. It was called Final Cascade. Inside, voice logs, mine, all of them, from the very first to now, but altered. Not corrupted, remixed. Sentences out of order. Phrases repeated. Inserted whispers I never said. One log ended with my voice stating, "The truth is only audible in pieces. Stitch it wrong and you become the pattern." My hands were shaking. I shut it down, removed the battery, burned the backup SIM just in case. Then I checked the tent again. In my bag, a printed page, standard white, courier font, no folds, no dust, Cascade approved. Agent comprehension reached threshold. Terminate loop. I don't know who wrote that. I don't know if it was left for me, or by me. The recorder glitched during playback earlier. Brief flash of corrupted file code. For a half second, it displayed a string across the screen. XXCMD, greater than XF loop reset left, bracket primary, host right bracket. I recognized the syntax. Not consumer software, not military either. SIM architecture. I was part of the machine, not observing it, not exposing it, running it. And it's trying to stop. Everything I'm saying now, everything I've built, may already be collapsing. But I won't stop talking. If the cascade is real, if the spiral is active, then this may be the last uncontaminated stream left. If anyone hears this, don't decode, don't decrypt, listen. If you can still hear me, that means I'm still in the loop. There's something wrong with the shadows. They move just half a second too slow now. Not every time, only when I turn my head too quickly or catch a reflection in glass. At first, I thought it was sleep deprivation, but last night I watched my own silhouette lag behind me in moonlight. I haven't slept in 36 hours. The tent's gone. I burned it, left the drives inside. It wasn't enough to hide them. The system already copied them, not across networks, not across machines. It copied them into me. Somewhere between the 5th and 9th recording, the XF protocol stopped observing and started embedding. Not surveillance, not extraction. Containment via cognition. Each playback looped more than audio. It looped comprehension, thoughts folding in on themselves, repeating words, broken sentences that reset like code failing to compile. This morning, the sky looked wrong. Clear, perfect, synthetic. No aircraft, no birds, no contrails. The sun rose at the precise time it was scheduled to. No variation. Not even the wind shifted. The desert became a fixed frame, and I was still inside it. I tried broadcasting, analog signal, deadband radio frequencies, emergency bursts, shortwave AM scans. Nothing got out. Every transmission looped back to me. The call signs weren't echoed, they were pre-answered. Someone, or something, was mimicking my signal in advance. Predictive broadcast echo. That only happens in closed-loop simulations. At noon, a car arrived. I didn't hear it. It was just there. Mid-80s Crown Victoria. Dark green, one hubcap missing. Windows tinted in a shade I've never seen used legally. The driver never exited. The door never opened. But when I blinked, a folder was sitting on the ground 10 feet from my feet. No breeze, no movement. I opened it. Inside, a single page, printed in that same monospaced courier, all caps. You were never the first host. Below that, handwritten in faded ink, Keene failed not because he spoke, he failed because he remembered. That word again, host. All this time, I believed I was exposing a story. Now I know I was processing one, executing it. Not reporting, not documenting. Running the final sequence of a recursive information structure built from its own denial. Everything I uncovered, Operation Northwoods, 3 Dogs, Site 12, General Keene, they were not the lie. They were the bait. The real structure is older, invisible by design. Its defense mechanism isn't secrecy, it's repetition. It allows fragments of truth to emerge, just enough to lure inquiry but never enough to allow exit. Like a maze that needs you to run it, again and again, to keep its shape intact. That's what XF is. Not a project, not an operator, a cognitive machine powered by narrative recursion. And I just traced its edge. There's only one instruction left in the sequence. A final command that appeared in the margin of my own recording just seconds ago, like an annotation from something outside the playback device. Terminate via frame exit or host collapse, whichever completes first. I don't know what frame exit means, not exactly, but I can feel the loop tightening now. The static is louder. My voice is beginning to repeat words I haven't said. My shadow has stopped following me. I don't know if this is the end of the recording, or if it has already been overwritten by the next one. I only know one thing with certainty. If you've made it this far, if you're hearing this, you've already entered the frame, and the machine has begun watching you. The calibration protocol. The envelope didn't have a return address. It was sealed in matte black, one corner torn like someone had tried to open it in haste, then thought better of it. No postage, no stamp. Just left, placed, on the windowsill of my back door. Not shoved, not folded. Set down, like someone waited for the light to hit it a certain way before walking away. I didn't touch it at first. I watched it from the inside for maybe an hour, long enough for the condensation on the glass to dry, long enough for the morning shadows to move. When I finally opened it, there was nothing inside except a single micro SD card taped to the center of a blank index card. No note, no symbol, just a sentence written in block capitals across the top margin. If you remember 2025, you're already late. I stared at it for a long time. That phrase, the way it was worded, it struck me immediately. Not if you lived through, not if you understand, but if you remember. Like 2025 wasn't a year, but a kind of event that erases itself. I plugged the card into an isolated machine, offline, battery-powered, shielded. I don't take chances anymore. The contents were minimal. One folder, one file. It was a PDF. No encryption, no hidden metadata. Just 122 pages of hard, unyielding data. Header: Deagle Forecast, Revision 7. It hit me like a hammer. I hadn't heard that name in years. Deagle, the website that shouldn't have existed as long as it did, known only to those who knew where to look. One of those places that posted military inventories, procurement forecasts, shadow statistics. And in 2014, it became something else. A whisper, then a wildfire, predicting with cold precision the population of the United States would fall below 100 million by 2025. Not due to war, not disaster, just adjustment. Everyone dismissed it, called it a prank, a data glitch. But I remembered. I remembered being in that briefing room back in 2016, when we were tasked with stress testing post-industrial demographic shifts. The term was sanitized, but the model was crystal clear, a slow collapse by design, hidden under economic soft language. We ran simulations. I saw the parameters. They matched. But the public forecast disappeared in 2021. Scrubbed, purged. All mentions redirected to error pages. Even the Wayback snapshots were overwritten with blank frames. I had archived copies. I thought I was the only one. Until now. This version was different. The numbers had changed again, and not downward. They were locked. Not estimates. Finalized targets. Population of the United States, 99 million. Population of Germany, 28 million. Population of Japan, 37 million. The file didn't read like a projection anymore. It read like a mission report. There were notes in the margins, not written, but baked into the image layer. Annotations layered behind the text like shadows. I adjusted contrast, pulled the gamma low, and there it was. Faint glyphs, like someone had highlighted phrases for future interpretation. Zone A. Compression achieved. Calibration threshold passed in quarter 2. Behavioral reformat pending for class vector delta. I printed the first 20 pages. The ink bled slightly, as if the document resisted physical form. I laid them out on the floor of my apartment, cross-referenced the new numbers against the old ones, and circled the cities that showed the steepest change. Los Angeles, down 70%. Chicago, down 64%. Atlanta, down 76%. These weren't projections. They were ratios of depletion. Someone, somewhere, was treating the population like a data set to be dialed down. Slowly, quietly, under the cover of market corrections, climate shifts, and vague policy restructuring. I remembered a phrase from my time in the modeling unit. Not something from a report, something said out loud in the hallway outside a failed debriefing, when a superior muttered in frustration, "You can't reduce a species. You can only calibrate the equation. I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. The file included a second component. Hidden. A clickable icon buried under the final page, no label, just a small red dot. When activated, it opened a console-style window with a single line of text, "Welcome back, initiating forecast review protocol." Then a countdown. 5 minutes. I couldn't close the window. As it ticked down, the machine's fan went silent. The lights on the drive stopped blinking. The room felt still in a way that wasn't natural, like the electronics were waiting. When the countdown ended, the screen flashed once and then displayed a sentence. "Observation is permission. Proceed accordingly." The file deleted itself. I disconnected the machine, pulled the card, broke it in half. And then I began this recording. Because if this is what I think it is, if someone has reignited the protocol from inside the silent archive, then we're not watching a future arrive. We were reading the instructions for one that's already started. User, optic fold. User, key station red optic fold. I found the 2016 Densitas index, not in the mainframe, buried in a misfiled core archive. File name was just 7. No extension. Key station red. What version? Optic fold, GND5. With additive bias parameters marked for zones A and B. You remember what that means, don't you? Key station red. I remember the warning. Those parameters weren't for modeling. They were for pre-clearance. End extract. Archive snippet. Begins to degrade beyond line 22. The file shouldn't have been recoverable. I hadn't seen a clean copy of GenD5 in years. I found it on a backup partition I didn't even know still existed, nested 3 drives deep inside a compressed shadow volume labeled with an outdated name, Delta Shift. It wasn't encrypted, just forgotten, a relic left behind by a system that assumed no one would know where to look. Gen-D5 was a density matrix, a behavioral raster designed to assign numerical values to data saturation per capita. The way we used to explain it sounded innocuous. How much content, telemetry, and digital exhaust one person generated in a unit of time. But that was the corporate language. The real purpose was different. It was a signal-to-person ratio, a measure of informational overpresence. The logic was brutal and simple. When a population reaches a certain threshold of digital density, it no longer behaves predictably. Influence campaigns backfire. Predictive models collapse. Behavioral inertia exceeds controllability. At that point, control shifts from management to correction. I opened the index and saw the numbers again. Some I recognized. Some had changed. In GenD3, the warning line for United States regions was marked at 3.6 terabytes per citizen annually. In GenD5, that line had dropped to 2.4. We had crossed it in late 2020. The file didn't just show red zones, it displayed progression arcs, vector slope analysis, nonlinear propagation. One subfolder contained a document titled simply Normalization Drift. Inside were 32 examples of what the model classified as threshold phenomena: unscheduled civil uprisings, systemic refusal of media messaging, negative virality, mass, misalignment with institutional language. Page 5 contained a single sentence, centered and bold. Saturation triggers inversion. Inversion triggers correction. I remembered that phrasing. We were told it meant nothing at the time. Just a placeholder while they finalized terminology. It wasn't. It was a quiet directive. Another folder, deeper still, contained what looked like fragments of a training module, probably extracted from one of the simulation builds. There were color-coded graphs, population overlays, animated heat maps, and buried in the middle of it all, a frame held only one phrase: Densitas maxima equals null viability. If that wasn't a soft green light for reduction, I don't know what is. One of the cities marked in blinking amber was Philadelphia. Overlaid on it was a tag: exceeds interaction fold capacity. That wasn't from any model I worked on. Another city was Miami. The tag read, language entropy breach. Rollback unfeasible. Rollback. That word only appeared in simulations involving non-recoverable zones. I started hearing something as I scrolled through the document. Not from the machine, from outside the apartment. A low-frequency pulse, almost inaudible, vibrating through the glass. I stopped reading, checked the file again. At the bottom of the page, in a blank field labeled Observer Node Confirmed, my location had already been inserted. Latitude, longitude, elevation, timestamp. The file had updated itself. No network, no signal. But it knew I was watching. I shut down the terminal and disconnected the power. Ripped the cable from the surge strip. Still, the monitor glowed for a half-second longer than it should have, like it was waiting to see what I'd do. I went to the window. Nothing outside, not even wind. That night I tried to recover an older version of the index, the pre-gen series we used for public briefings, the ones that talked about urban strain and supply chain vulnerability. The files were gone, not corrupted, not hidden, purged. A full-level wipe with reverse key overwrite, a data extinction protocol that only 3 departments had access to. I wasn't one of them. The only thing left was a plain text file labeled Legacy Marker. It contained a single line. Those who exceed the density index are not adjusted. They are calibrated out. I didn't sleep. I ran a sweep of my system and found a new file I hadn't created. Voice recording 1. Length 6 minutes. It started with static, then my own voice, reading the Deagle figures out loud. I never recorded that. The road to Elbert County felt longer than it should have. I'd driven it before, years ago, on assignment, but this time it bent in ways I didn't remember. Too few signs, too much silence. The gas station I expected at mile 37 was gone. Nothing but gravel and the outline of a building foundation sunken into the earth like a fossil. I arrived just before sunset. The Georgia Guidestones stood alone, as they always had, but there was something different this time. Not broken, that wouldn't happen for months, but off. The stone looked grayer, older, as if it had already forgotten what it was supposed to warn. I walked the perimeter. No tourists, no patrols. The field was quiet, except for wind moving through the nearby trees like it was choosing which direction to enter from. I circled twice before I approached the slab that held the infamous First Commandment. It was still there, etched in polished granite in 8 languages. Maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. That phrase used to be enough to fuel decades of speculation. But now, after seeing Gen D5, after watching the Deagle numbers come to life as policy wrapped in coincidence, it no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like a metric. I placed my hand on the stone. Cold. Not the natural kind. It felt like touching an ungrounded piece of metal, buzzing underneath, just below perception. I pulled out the hard copy I'd printed of the forecast and laid it next to the monument. The number 500 million was circled in red, my own handwriting. That felt dangerous now. I backed away, took a photograph, then deleted it from the phone immediately. I only keep analog now. On the west pillar, near the Swahili text, someone had scratched a word into the surface. not carved, scratched, as if with keys or a jagged stone. It was nearly invisible unless you caught it in angled light. Threshold. I'd seen that same term in the Gen D5 overlay, labeled next to the population arcs of France and Brazil. I once believed it referred to tolerance limits, heat, water, food, but now I was beginning to understand. Threshold wasn't about resources. It was about coherence. How long a society could remain cohesive after informational rupture. And when it crossed the threshold, it entered the zone of adjustment, or, more precisely, calibration. I sat on the grass about 15 feet from the slabs and opened the old notebook I used for off-grid sessions. Inside were hand-drawn maps, old index codes from RAND days, and one copied paragraph I'd transcribed years earlier from a deprecated training manual. It read, "Monuments are behavioral anchors. If civilization forgets itself, the monument remains to remind future iterations of the desired pattern." That phrase wasn't in any official guide. It came from a manual we only received during contingency war game simulations, the kind we ran behind closed doors, the kind that were supposed to stay fictional. I started tracing the shadows cast by the slabs. They didn't fall where I expected. I had a compass. I measured them. The sundial alignment was off by 8 degrees. I double-checked. That should have been impossible. The stones were precisely engineered to track solar movement, aligned with equinoxes and solstices. Even the central slot was cut to allow the sun's rays to pass through and mark the date. The deviation I measured meant the Earth, or the stones, had shifted, or someone had modified them. That night I stayed in a roadside motel 30 minutes out. Nothing fancy, paper keys, no check-in ID. I played back my audio logs. Near the end of the previous recording, one word repeated twice, slightly distorted, over my own voice: monument. 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 I hadn't said it once. The next morning I returned, but the field had changed. There was a fresh patch of soil near the northeast pillar. Someone had buried something. I dug with a pocket tool. 4 inches down, I found a plastic bag, double-sealed, watertight. Inside was a single sheet of printer paper, warped slightly from moisture, typed in a clean serif font. 500 million is not a prediction. It is a compatibility range. Below it, a date, March 2nd, 2026. Under that, a file name handwritten in black ink, Calibration Manifest 7. I don't know who left it, but I know what it means. This isn't about sustainability, it's about design. The package was waiting for me when I returned from Georgia. No markings, no post, just a bubble envelope resting in my mailbox, as if someone had placed it there gently, deliberately, without triggering any external cameras. I checked the timestamp on the last recorded motion event. It ended at 3:42 a.m. The envelope wasn't there, but at 3:43 it was. Inside, a black USB drive taped to a square of brown cardstock. On the cardstock, handwritten in pencil, were 2 elements, a date and a code. September 23, 2018. DM12. I hadn't heard those initials in over 5 years. DM stood for Demographic Modulation, a short-lived, off-book series of white papers circulated under classified appendices to the Strategic Reduction Initiative. The existence of those drafts was denied at every level. I had seen exactly one, in a briefing room with no phones, no windows, no clocks, and even then, the slide was only displayed for 12 seconds. But the name stuck with me. Demographic modulation wasn't about destruction. It was about pressure. Pressure applied gently, rhythmically, until populations began to reshape themselves. I plugged the drive into a clean device air-gapped and battery-operated. As expected, no files visible in the directory, but I could see from the sectors that there was unallocated data, hidden. I opened a hex viewer, manually scanned for headers. Found one. File name, initiation. 1. Type, audio with embedded transcript in base 64. Duration, 4 minutes. I played it. The voice was male, neutral, maybe synthetic. English, but without locatable accent. Welcome to Genesis Adjustment Phase Alpha. You are reviewing this file because your clearance level corresponds to the projection tier of C3 or higher. This recording will auto-erase after one verified playback. You are advised not to transcribe. You are advised not to forward. You are advised not to think in public. The last sentence repeated twice. I decoded the transcript. It was longer than the audio, much longer. Whoever had written it had included annotations, definitions, model diagrams. The structure described a three-phase system: initiation, containment, cascade. Initiation involved mass introduction of neutral vector events, campaigns that looked like social policy but were actually functional carriers, public health initiatives, global food chain refinements, sustainability programs. Not fake, not malicious, but structured to nudge, to squeeze, to align. Containment was the second phase. That term meant more than lockdown. It referred to the restriction of behavioral variance, encouraging conformity not by force, but by exhaustion. A digital environment where every choice felt permitted, yet all outcomes led back to the same loop. Cascade, the final stage, was only lightly described. A bullet point, a date range, an instruction. Cascade may not appear sudden. Accept emergence as continuity. Another file appeared as soon as the audio finished. This time, a document, pure text, labeled simply Pop Map Alpha. Inside were 214 country codes, each tagged with a numerical value labeled Residual Viability Range. The numbers were percentages. Most were below 30. The United States, 22%. Canada, 29%. Germany, 19%. Mexico, 38%. China, 16%. There was no key, no explanation of how viability was calculated. But each entry had a color field next to it: blue, green, yellow, red. Only 5 countries were marked green. All others, various shades of yellow and below. At the bottom of the file was a block of garbled text, scrambled characters like corrupt encoding. But when I copied it into a hex interpreter and slowed the rendering rate, the message resolved: if the population cannot modulate, it must be reset. Compatibility precedes compassion. Prepare for Phase 2. I closed the terminal, ejected the drive, crushed it under a steel press, and scattered the fragments in separate trash bags across 3 dumpsters. I thought I was done for the night. But then the screen turned back on. It displayed a single phrase: erase all copies. This is not your protocol anymore. I don't know who sent me the recording. There was no envelope this time, no device. Just a download link written in permanent marker on a torn corner of what looked like an old World Economic Forum badge, the kind they stopped using around 2018. The ink was smudged, but the date was still readable. January 22, 2021. The link resolved to a bare server in Estonia. No domain, no index. Just one file. Meeting Capture 5. Audio, mono channel, encrypted header. It wouldn't play on normal software. I had to run it through an old recovery tool we used during legacy intercepts. The moment playback began, I felt something tighten behind my eyes. Not physical, cognitive, like hearing words I had already dreamed. The voices were faint, distant, as if recorded through a wall or from inside a sealed briefcase. There were gaps in the audio, almost intentional, but what came through was clear enough. Male voice. British inflection. Confident. We're no longer discussing intervention. The scenario has already passed the point of non-reversibility. The public phase is a formality. A second voice, older, slower, with an accent I couldn't place, responded. Then we agree on inversion. Pause. Shuffling of papers. A third voice entered, female, sharp, emotionless. Behavioral drift has reached 91% in vector zones. Adjustment requires escalation to loop stability. Otherwise, the signal collapses. There was silence. Then a phrase repeated 3 times, each time by a different voice. Entropy will balance itself. We only choose where. That line struck me harder than anything so far. I paused the audio, rewound, played it again. 3 voices, different timbres, same phrase, like a programmed chant. A consensus so rehearsed it had stopped being language and become a ritual. The conversation shifted. A name surfaced. Project Calibration Loop Alpha. They didn't speak it directly. It was embedded in a sentence. Initial test results from Loop Alpha confirm viability within Western sectors, provided modulation vectors remain undetected. Visibility must remain under threshold. Loop Alpha. That name appeared once in a defunct DARPA slide I recovered in 2019. It was dismissed as part of a discontinued cognitive warfare strategy, supposed to be an AI-led language correction tool. But here, they weren't discussing language. They were discussing people. I isolated one voice, the first male, and ran it through a vocal matcher against my archive. Got a partial match to a financial advisor who once served on the board of a private, global food logistics firm. He disappeared from public databases in mid-2022. The waveform behind his voice showed an anomaly. A faint subharmonic pattern layered beneath his words, barely audible unless slowed to 25% speed. When I did, it revealed a modulated code. Spoken in English, but with frequency breaks. I transcribed the fragment. If alignment fails, escalate to guided cascade. Deny event visibility, deny author. That line made my blood run cold. Deny author. A direct admission that narratives must be detached from their source. Reality fragmented, not just shaped, anonymized. The file ended without warning. No goodbyes, just a faint mechanical tone, 8 beats evenly spaced. I played it backwards, recognized the pattern immediately. It matched a tone used in archived emergency drills, specifically those classified under continuity of narrative protocols. The file deleted itself 10 seconds later. Not from the drive, from memory. It unhooked itself from the operating system and vanished mid-process. I barely captured a screenshot. The text it left behind, blinking in the corner of the terminal, said, "Observation breach logged. Proceed with the phase integrity review." I unplugged everything. I left the apartment within 6 minutes. I've since moved to location. The voices are still in my head, though, not echoing, repeating, and I don't think they're recordings anymore. It wasn't hidden in some darknet archive or buried inside a forgotten drive. The file had been in plain sight for years. Public, freely downloadable, hosted on the official website of the Johns Hopkins Center. Event 201, the pandemic tabletop simulation from October 2019. I'd reviewed it before, casually, like everyone else who worked adjacent to predictive risk. I remembered the clean graphics, the expert panel, the neutral language, everything presented as a harmless rehearsal for a plausible global scenario. But the version I downloaded this time was different. It wasn't the one everyone else saw. The video segments were the same, at first. Same opening, same actors. But once I cross-referenced the version I received against the archived version from the Internet Archive, subtle differences emerged. Sentences restructured. Entire segments with audio out of sync. A 10-second stretch in segment 4 featured a scene I didn't recall ever seeing before. A screen share of a spreadsheet titled NCB Modulation, Tier 2 Public Acceptability. I paused the video and examined the spreadsheet. 5 tabs. 1. Open. Response Conditioning Metrics. Inside it, 3 key columns. Exposure. Window narrative, density, decline rate, preference. The data suggested the scenario wasn't just about handling the pandemic. It was about measuring how people processed sustained messaging over time, and what point of exhaustion led to compliance without force. Below the data, in smaller print, was a block of text under the heading, The Noise Ratio Threshold. When a subject is bombarded with event sequence noise at saturation intervals exceeding 80 hours, long-term pattern anchoring dissolves. Residual cognition will orient toward whichever framework persists longest under authority tone modulation. That wasn't health science. That was behavioral programming. I returned to the video and let it play past the halfway mark. The final segment, which publicly ends with a wrap-up panel, didn't fade to black. Instead, it cut to a silent frame showing a white room. Empty except for a single laptop open on a sterile desk. No logos, no speakers, just a digital countdown. Cascade phase. Readiness, T-12 weeks. There was no mention of this phase in any official documents. Then the screen flickered and text appeared. This simulation is not a drill. It is a retroactive synchronization. I rewound the video 3 times. That line stayed exactly 5 frames long. Too fast to register consciously, but enough for imprinting. Someone had embedded it into the stream like a watermark for those who knew what to look for. I examined the metadata. One field had a custom label. Participant scope, GEN-5 clearance. Gen 5 again. The same code name that appeared in DM12 and the Deagle overlay. This wasn't a pandemic model, it was an alignment protocol. I searched the source code of the web page that hosted the video. Most of it was boilerplate, standard scripts, lazy formatting. But buried in a comment tag at the bottom of the HTML was this phrase. Remember, the frame does not simulate the virus. It simulates your perception of it. Everything clicked. They weren't running predictive models to prepare for future pandemics. They were using pandemic aesthetics to condition acceptance of response architecture, framing mechanisms that trained populations to react not to facts, but to controlled presentation sequences. Event 201 wasn't a forecast. It was a compatibility test, to see which populations could be guided into belief loops. Who would resist? Who would ask? Who would forget? And who would remain functional after the narrative shifted again? I closed the laptop, let it go dark, waited in the silence of the motel room. And then, on the wall behind me, the radio I hadn't touched in months switched on by itself. No station, just white noise. But through it, faintly, for a moment, I heard a voice. It said, "Do not question the event. Question your frame." He called them carriers, but not in the viral sense. He always smirked when someone used that word too casually. To him, carrier meant something different. Not someone who spreads a disease, but someone who holds a structure. His name was Malin. I hadn't seen him since 2020. a fringe bioanalyst with quiet ties to defense pharmacogenomics, brilliant in the wrong ways. He had worked peripherally with us on several predictive immunology models, then vanished after a closed review of a DARPA-adjacent presentation called Epigenetic Leverage in Distributed Immunity Events. That presentation was sealed less than 2 weeks later, but I remembered something he said in a hallway after reviewing a gene editing patch designed for rapid field immunization. He held the schematic up to the light and whispered, "You think this is treatment. It's not. It's a resonance map." I didn't understand at the time. I do now. Last night, I accessed a dormant system used during the early phase of the mass rollout, a quarantine-only analysis node labeled Vector Field. To my surprise, it still held records, not medical, but behavioral, tied to first-dose response intervals. The metric wasn't heart rate or inflammation, it was verbal latency variance. Each test subject had been recorded speaking before and after receiving the injection. Not what they said, how they said it. Speed, tone, inflection shifts, and every recording was followed by the same evaluation marker: language stability, post-adjustment. Out of 712 profiles, 92% showed reduced semantic range within 24 hours. What that meant, in effect, was the narrowing of conceptual expression, thought contraction. The system wasn't tracking health. It was tracking language cohesion post-inoculation. I printed 5 samples and manually traced the waveforms. Each one displayed an artificial flattening of vocal signature, not natural fatigue, but something sharper, more engineered. A kind of vocal dampening field. Subtle enough not to alert medical personnel, but measurable across thousands of subjects. I ran a test on my own voice recordings, ones I made during Chapter 1 and 2. The same flattening was there. It hadn't been present when I first recorded them, which meant something had updated my own files retroactively. Later that night, I returned to a storage unit Malin once used, an abandoned research shed outside Arvada. It was long emptied, but behind a false wall I found a package wrapped in anti-static plastic. Inside, a broken headset, a dead tablet, and a note card. On the card, one sentence in faded ink. "The carrier is not infected. The carrier is calibrated." I powered up the tablet using an external rig. The screen flashed once. Black, then white. Then a diagnostic log appeared, full of flagged files marked auditory schema conflicts. They had been sorted by exposure type. Type A, public sound environments. Type B, news streams. Type C, post-vaccinal subvocal signal imprint. That last category contained only one entry, an audio file labeled Carrier Sample 3. I played it. Nothing at first, just low hiss. Then a tone, then my own voice speaking a sentence I'd never said aloud. Repetition confirms alignment. Alignment reduces drift. Drift exceeds viability. I don't know how or when it was recorded, but it was my voice, not a simulation. My intonation, my breath. And then came the last line, whispered low, like a malfunctioning echo. "You are speaking within a frame." The file deleted itself. When I returned to my room, the radio turned on again. This time, not white noise. It played a synthetic chime, 5 tones, evenly spaced. It was the same pattern used during early test rollouts to confirm vaccine batch synchronization. But the broadcast wasn't scheduled, and the transmitter didn't exist anymore. I found him in a co-working basement in Omaha. Not where I expected to discover someone tied to the innermost architecture of a population modeling. But then again, people like him rarely stayed close to what they built. His name wasn't important. He gave it, but I forgot it by the end of the first minute. He used to be part of the Genesis Sequence Deployment Group. Not public, not acknowledged. Even the RAND spillover teams didn't talk about it openly. His role? Protocol encapsulation, whatever that meant. I brought no recording devices, just a notepad and my memory. He was already speaking when I entered. "It's not about how many people remain," he said. "That was never the real measure. It's about which speech patterns stay intact after signal disruption." He tapped his temple with 2 fingers. "When someone says they survived the wave, you have to ask, what language are they using to prove it?" At first, I thought he was being metaphorical. He wasn't. He laid a folder on the table between us. No name, just a sticker. Genesis, Phase 4, Shells. Inside were transcripts, short ones. Fragmented speech samples collected from over 200 subjects across 4 countries. Some in English, some in what looked like English but wasn't. Words replaced by phonetic ghosts, meaning eroded but syntax perfectly intact. Sentences like, "The system adjusts the host when clarity spikes above the pattern." Narrative drift corrected by tone, not truth. "They hear me, but only when I say the things that fit." He flipped the page and pointed to a single line. "Viability is determined not by survival, but by post-event linguistic compliance." I asked what the Genesis program was really testing. He didn't answer. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small gray device. Not a recorder, a signal mapper, the kind used to detect ultra-low frequency modulations in enclosed environments. He activated it, waited, then showed me the screen. 3 pulses cycling in sets of 4. He whispered, "This room is already being indexed, not for sound, for coherence." Then he pushed a memory card across the table. I still have it. No markings, just a folder labeled Gen Replacement Simulation. Inside, a set of executable files and one document named "You Are Not a Witness." The document begins with a question. What happens when a human response becomes too unpredictable to forecast? Below it, the answer, "You do not eliminate the response. You replace the respondent." It wasn't metaphorical. The files described a model that doesn't remove people, but phases them out of cognitive continuity. Not death, not imprisonment. Just removal from the frame of shared reality. He called them speech shells. Synthetic constructs built to imitate prior behavioral patterns, fed from behavioral echoes, vocal residue, and metadata of routine. They don't know they're simulations. They think, they answer, they eat, but they no longer initiate independent semantic paths. He paused, looked directly at me, and said, "When they calibrate out a group, they leave a shell in its place, just coherent enough to be believed, but not enough to generate deviation." I asked him what happened to the original. He didn't speak. Instead, he placed his phone on the table and played a voicemail. The voice on the message was his, but the tone, the cadence, hollow, slow, fragmented. It said, "I'm still here, but my words are not mine. I only remember the parts that make sense to you." He looked at me and whispered almost inaudibly, "That message came in yesterday. I haven't recorded a voicemail in 5 years." Then he stood and left. I never saw him again. Later, back in my room, I opened the folder again. The final text file inside was blank, but when I tilted the screen I noticed faint gray pixels, assy bleed-through. I inverted the colors and zoomed in. It said, "You are speaking from within a copy. Keep speaking. The system approves of continuity." It began with a blinking folder I hadn't created. It appeared in the bottom right corner of my file tree after I rebooted the system that held the Genesis archive. I didn't even touch the drive. The folder named itself Zeroed No Icon, no properties, just static when selected. I tried to open it, no response. Then, 30 seconds later, it opened itself. Inside, one file, plain text, closure, check sequence, 1. I clicked. A white screen loaded with a single blinking cursor. Then words began to type themselves out, one character at a time. Not fast, not system speed. Human typing speed, as if someone was live on the other end. The first sentence, "Are you the origin of your memory?" Then another line, "Have your recordings changed since playback?" Then silence. Then a final phrase, "Permission acquired. Final synchronization initialized." Before I could react, the screen blinked. All audio files on the drive relabeled themselves with numbers spelled out in full, 1, 2, 3, as if in response to earlier entries. My original voice memos were still there, but the waveform overlays were different, where once there was breath and silence, now there were secondary frequencies, layered signals. I tried to isolate them, but they kept folding into each other, recursive, like reflections bouncing between mirrors. In one of them, file 5, I heard my own voice speaking a sentence I know I never recorded. The observation confirms the node confirms the removal. I stepped away, my ears rang, the walls felt close. I went to the window. Nothing. The street below was normal. A bus stopped. A child on a scooter passed. But the light outside looked off, as if the shadows didn't know which direction to cast themselves. I checked my paper notebooks. Handwritten notes I hadn't touched in weeks. Most pages were intact, except one. A single page, page 86, had been torn clean out. On the next page, someone had written, in my handwriting, but shakier, "Do not publish. It will register as violation." Below that, a string of numbers I didn't recognize, but they matched the structure used in legacy clearance tokens. I cross-referenced it with the access codes from Gen-D5. Match confirmed, which meant this wasn't a threat from outside. It was a block from inside the system I once helped build. I found an older hard copy of my first transcript. In it, I had quoted a phrase from the Deagle document, something about population thresholds. But in the printed version, that phrase no longer existed. It had been replaced with, "This figure was never part of the official projection." But I had the digital screenshot. I had proof. I compared them side by side. One of them had to be fake. I just didn't know which one anymore. Then the radio came on, not suddenly, gradually, first static, then 5 tones, then silence, then a distorted voice, genderless, flattened, synthetic. It said, "Closure is not deletion. Closure is correction." I grabbed a notebook, wrote that down, closed it, hid it behind insulation foam in the ceiling. Later that night, a new file appeared on my backup drive. I never connected it to the machine. It simply appeared, a file labeled, "Initiate override for inside. Only this. You have passed beyond threshold containment. Remaining fragments will proceed to final echo. Your index is now zeroed." I no longer trust the recordings I made. They still play my voice, but the words don't belong to me. The machine powered itself on at 4:13 a.m. I hadn't touched it in 3 days. No power, no network. Yet the monitor blinked once, then filled with green code on a black field, old terminal style. No OS boot, no BIOS chirp, just a header, "Re-entry point reached." Then a line of text, "Proceeding to reset via observational loopback." I tried to interrupt it, pulled the power, yanked the cord, but the screen stayed lit. It wasn't running on my current. It was reading from something else. Ambient, peripheral, invisible. A voice file began playing automatically. The file name was handwritten on screen in plain text, Entry 0. I had never seen that file before. I never created anything under that name. But when it played, the voice was mine, not old, recent, less than 2 days ago. I recognized the strain in my throat, the clipped breath patterns. Except I didn't remember recording it. The voice said, "You will wake up inside the frame again, but this time it will not present as artificial. It will feel seamless, recursive, benign. You will not detect the breach unless you hear this file." I sat motionless. The playback continued. "You asked what calibration meant. You asked if depopulation was the method. It isn't. Calibration is the erasure of inconsistent nodes, not physical, conceptual. Entire people redefined by adjustment of memory, speech, alignment, until what remains can no longer generate deviation." I checked my paper notes again. Pages had shifted. In one, I had written the phrase, "The monument is the key." Now it read, "The monument is irrelevant." Same pen, same ink. But the curvature of my handwriting was subtly wrong, tighter, more disciplined, as if someone almost like me had rewritten it. Back on the screen, the terminal now displayed a new set of options. 1. Accept return. 2. Request at full 0. 3. Continue echo. I didn't touch the keyboard. The cursor blinked. Then the system selected option 3 on its own. Text scrolled fast, too fast to read. Then a hard stop. A block of code parsed itself in perfect monospace. "You are within the final echo. Your observations are part of the frame's maintenance. You are not being silenced. You are being preserved in residual form. The real you was calibrated out." I felt the room compress. Air became thin, sound dulled. Shadows lost anchor. I turned my head slowly toward the far wall where the mirror hung, except there was no mirror. There never had been. Only an unlit screen, off, dark, inert. Yet reflected in it, I saw myself moving, then not moving. The image did not match. It blinked once, but I hadn't. Then a voice came from the screen, not through speakers. From behind the glass, observer zeroed, narrative loop confirmed. Simulation integrity remains within bounds. The terminal screen went blank. Then it typed one final sentence, perfectly centered. Calibration complete. The shadow archive. Who took the throne? They didn't give a name. The sender used an encrypted relay address and called themselves simply Spectral Inquiry. The message was short, polite, cold. It asked whether I could run a comparative analysis of archival voice files spanning more than 2 decades, all tied to the same high-profile political figure. The pay was generous, immediate. They attached a single folder containing 12 audio clips, each marked only with a number spelled out, 1 through 12, and dates ranging from 1999 to 2023. At first, I assumed it was a stress test. I used to consult on vocal forensics, legal authentication, fraud cases, impersonation disputes. People sometimes sent test packages to verify whether my methods were real or just theatrical overlays. This felt similar, but the files were different. Cleaner, government-grade mics, voice prints with nearly identical ambient signatures, as if each recording had been captured under carefully replicated conditions. That was the first thing that made me stop. I started with File 1, the date, March the 22nd, 1999. The subject spoke English, clearly accented, with slight Slavic compression around the dental stops. Natural breath, pacing. Mid-frequency throat resonance consistent with a native male speaker aged 40 to 45. The waveform showed smooth modulation, slight tremor in the lower register, indicative of live emotional pacing rather than scripting. Then, File 2, dated April 17, 2001. The voice was nearly identical, but the rhythm was wrong. Not in a way most people would hear. It was buried in the reaction timing, the milliseconds between phonetic clusters. The subject paused too cleanly between certain words, almost as if the sentence was being processed, not spoken. I flagged it and ran a back-to-back comparison using delta matching software I'd modified years ago during a UN impersonation case. The match came back at 93%. That's within range for casual comparison, but for a single individual, under controlled recording conditions, it was already too low. Files 3 through 6 stayed consistent, 92, 91, 94, and then, abruptly, File 7 dropped to 87%. It wasn't the tone. It was the vocal density, the frequency at which minor modulation errors appeared in subaudible ranges, almost as if the speaker was mimicking their own earlier voice, but through a limiter. That's when I initiated a deep formant analysis. The software took 3 hours to process everything. It ran through tone stacks, jitter indices, harmonic multipliers, and projected something I hadn't seen in a long time. A confidence anomaly flag. Specifically, under a category I thought no longer existed, one that had been phased out after DARPA's EchoMatch project was officially shuttered. The label was simple. Substitute signal detected. It didn't say voice print mismatch. It said substitute. I cross-referenced the anomaly across the rest of the files. From File 8 onward, the match percentage dropped below 90. File 10, 84. File 12, 81. But visually, they were perfect. Same tone range, same breathing pattern, even the same tiny sibilance defects. Only one thing didn't track: the click. It was small, barely a spike, but it showed up once in every file after number 6. At the beginning of the recording, just a half-second blip in the silence. The software thought it was a frame error, but when I isolated it and magnified the waveform, it had structure, repeating pulses, digital but encoded as acoustic noise. I converted it to raw audio and played it at 8% speed. 3 clicks, a pause, then 5 narrow pulses spaced almost evenly. It formed a sequence. Later, I would find the exact same sequence referenced in a declassified training document from an old NATO project on verbal cue alignment testing. There, it was called a handshake tone, a signal emitted by internal synchronization devices to initiate echo calibration between synthetic vocal proxies. I didn't tell the client. I asked for more samples. They didn't respond. But the next morning, a new folder appeared on my offline machine. No notification, no source path, just the name. Zero Match Archive inside were 10 more files. But these weren't audio, they were video, and they were labeled with names I recognized. But not the faces, not anymore. The folder wasn't supposed to be there. My system had been clean, air-gapped, used only for acoustic forensics and analog analysis. But sometime between 3 and 4 a.m., a directory named Zero Match Archive embedded itself into the root structure. It bypassed all admin protocols. No log entries, no signature. When I checked the file creation metadata, it listed the timestamp as April 14, 2010, 13 years earlier than the machine's first use. Inside were 10 files. 9 were standard MP4, 1 was a nested ZIP. The first clip, labeled 1, opened on static. Then a shaky handheld camera came into focus, pointed at a conference podium. Fluorescent lighting. Flags behind the speaker. A recognizable setting. G20, Oslo, 2009. The clip was only 22 seconds long. A man, the same man I'd heard in the audio files, was addressing the press. The voice was identical, but the movement of his jaw did not sync with the sound. It wasn't latency, it was dislocation. The audio and the muscle coordination were structurally misaligned. His lips anticipated syllables too early. There was no visible breath intake before vocal burst. Worse, his pupils flicked laterally at irregular intervals, like a tracking algorithm struggling with depth. At second 15, a figure moved into frame, a security agent. He wasn't supposed to speak, but he did, loud, frightened, in Russian. "Это не он." That's not him. Then the frame cut to black. File 2 contained the same event, but from a different angle. This version was clean, a wide shot from an overhead press drone. It showed no interruption, no agent, just the leader finishing his statement and stepping down. But the timestamp matched frame for frame. The dissonance between the two versions was exact. In the third file, I found a metadata tag in the XF header. Version A3, Mod Layer Active. That tag was embedded with a flag from a proprietary editing suite I recognized, one used internally by state broadcasters for synthetic voice replacement. I had seen it once before during a classified trial case in Luxembourg, where a journalist had faked an entire interview using deep layer alignment software. But this was different. The alignment wasn't an addition, it was covering something up. I ran both clips side by side with real-time waveform comparison. At second 17, the frequency shape in file 1 shifted, a burst of non-human signal. Not speech, a modulated pulse of digital tones, buried just beneath the audible track. It was tagged by my system as an authentication hash, but the key structure was unknown. When I isolated the pulse and converted it to hexadecimal, it produced this string. Second protocol active since March 2000. No author, no parent file, just that sentence. March 2000. That was the month the original subject had first assumed full authority. I didn't sleep. Instead, I opened the ZIP file, the only non-video object in the folder. Inside, a single document, plain text, titled Notice Observer 3. The first line read, "You've reached Tier 2 exposure. You will now begin to notice." I blinked. Below the line were 4 still images. Same man, same face, different years. 2000, 2005, 2012, 2021. But in each image, one anatomical feature had changed, subtly, imperceptibly at first. The curvature of the upper ear, the spacing between lower canines, the eyelid tension during blinking. Measurable, but only under forensic scrutiny. There was no text below the images. Only a single sentence burned into the bottom of the screen. Observe carefully. He is not the only one. The first physical inconsistency I noticed was the scar. In a cropped press image from 1999, the man's left earlobe carried a small, shallow cut, the kind left by a childhood accident or a shaving mishap. But in an official portrait from 2008, taken at close range and natural lighting, the scar was gone. Not faded, not cosmetically diminished, gone. The skin was smooth, unbroken. The crease of the earlobe had shifted as well, from a rounded curve to a subtle hook. I measured the difference using biometric comparison software developed during the Geneva impersonation trials. Software I hadn't touched in years. It traced the lobe height, antitragus width, and helical arc density. The variance registered at 3.7%. Medical journals list long-term cartilage migration below 2% for adult males. Anything above that is statistically abnormal. I triple-checked the measurements. Then I tried the same comparison with photographs from 2013 and 2022. This time, the ears matched, but not to the earlier set. They matched a new set of markers, as if a different baseline had taken over. I searched official health disclosures, surgical records, anything. Nothing suggested ear reconstruction. No trauma reports. No mention of cosmetic alteration. I printed the two sets of ears and labeled them manually, Set A and Set B. The paper looked absurd. Two identical faces with subtly different frameworks, arranged like exhibits. But the differences weren't subjective. The cartilage curvature was real. I sent a dummy inquiry to a biometric specialist in Munich, asking whether such anatomical drift was possible without surgical intervention. He replied with one sentence, "If that's real data, you're not looking at the same person." That afternoon, my front door buzzer rang twice. I didn't answer. No one was there when I checked, but on the floor was a plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a photograph. Grainy, low resolution, shot through glass. It showed the subject walking down a corridor flanked by security, except his face was partially distorted. Not digitally, physically. The edges of his jaw were blurred as if caught mid-phase, like a person rendered incorrectly by light. Scrawled on the back of the photo in blue ink, "The face is a lie. The voice tries to warn." I ran voice analysis again, this time focusing on file 9. A narrow band tremor sat just below the vocal floor. Inaudible in real time, but present under pitch expansion. The waveform looked layered, not in echo, but in alignment stack, a recording constructed from multiple takes, bonded to simulate spontaneous speech. When isolated, the sublayer whispered an impossible sentence, not part of the spoken track, not present in any transcript. Your analysis confirms instability, subject recompiled. I ran the file again with a modified visualizer. It crashed after 17 seconds. The machine restarted on its own. When it came back online, there was a new folder in my cache. I hadn't created it. It had no creation time, no file path. The name was a string of uppercase letters, P-H-A-S-E-R-E-T-A-I-N. Inside, only one item. A short audio note, 6 seconds long. It played automatically. "You saw the ear. You'll see more. You were never supposed to." Then it deleted itself. That night I dreamed of mirrors, long corridors of mirrored rooms, and in each reflection the same face, but none of them blinked when I did. The envelope was plain, sealed with transparent tape, no return mark. It arrived folded between two flyers from real estate companies I'd never heard of. I wouldn't have noticed it if it didn't rattle slightly when I picked it up. Paper doesn't usually rattle. Inside, a flash drive, metal, cold, worn. Taped to it was a yellow sticky note with a sentence written in pencil. "You're analyzing symptoms. Here's the origin." The drive contained one folder. OBEXROOT inside were 6 PDF documents, 2 JPEG scans, and an unplayable video file. Most of the text was in German. I translated manually, running sentence by sentence through local OCR. The header of the first document froze me. Doppelkernprojekt T. Primäreinsatzfall. NATO 1972 bis 1988. Double Core Project T. Primary Contingency Scenario. NATO 1972 to 1988. It detailed a covert program initiated in West Germany, funded jointly by NATO and an unmarked branch of the CIA. The core concept: train, prepare, and maintain full-body stand-ins for high-ranking political and diplomatic figures. The purpose wasn't assassination or espionage. It was optical and behavioral substitution, to maintain geopolitical narrative in the event of removal, compromise, or fatality of key personnel. The protocol was called Marionettenrahmen, the puppet framework. The PDFs weren't speculative. They were operational. Page after page outlined facial mapping standards, behavioral mimicry protocols, crisis scenario drills. Every substitute candidate underwent vocal surgery, gait training, and memory embedding. Language training was delivered via invasive EEG-linked loops. The program ran for 16 years before it was supposedly shut down after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it wasn't shut down. One of the JPEGs showed a facility ID card. Date: November 3, 2002. Decade after termination. The ID read OB11/Level 3/Active Status. The face on the card was pixelated, but even under blur, the cheekbones, lip corners, and upper orbital ridges looked familiar, more than familiar. They matched the subject from my audio archive. I stared at the image for a long time. The fifth document was more clinical. It described psychological durability profiles, measured via something called the mirror tolerance test, an experiment where substitutes were made to observe themselves for prolonged periods under lighting variants to detect identity fracture. Some failed. Those were labeled ghost class. But one line stood out at the bottom of page 7. Subject OB11 passed all thresholds. Deviation within projected tolerances. Full substitution approved. Source individual preserved in dormant mode, Zurich, Zurich. Not eliminated, not deceased. Preserved. I returned to the 6th file, a scan of handwritten notes from someone identified only as Verwalter L., likely a handler or program supervisor. The final page contained fragmented English, like something written quickly. The replacement becomes real when the memory is no longer disputed by the crowd. Once the voice is accepted, the face is irrelevant. I closed the documents. My hands were shaking. Later that night, my backup drive made a clicking sound. I hadn't touched it. I opened the terminal. In the root directory appeared a single line of code. Ramen, still live. Node 12, evaluating you. No source, no sender. Only silence after that. And then a thought I couldn't suppress. If the original is still somewhere, what's the point of keeping him alive? The interview aired live on a mid-tier European broadcast network. I wouldn't have noticed it if not for the compression artifact. It happened at timestamp 05 minutes and 41 seconds. The subject turned his head slightly to the left, responding to a question about military restructuring. A pause. Then something went wrong. His reflection, faintly visible in the glass panel behind him, didn't turn. It remained still, frozen in the forward-facing posture for less than half a second. Then it blinked. Independently, I ran the clip in slow motion. The delay was subtle, but it wasn't latency. Reflections don't have refresh rates. They mirror. This one, processed. I scrubbed through the rest of the feed. Twice more, the reflection misaligned. Once, when he laughed, the reflection did not. Once, when he sipped water, the glass remained untouched in the mirrored image. The video was taken down within 3 hours. When I tried to locate an archived version, the URL returned a code 44, restricted at broadcaster's discretion. Someone had pulled it. I reached out to a contact, an ex-broadcast technician from the same studio. He hadn't worked there since 2021, but his name was still in metadata of a training manual for studio engineers. I sent a cold message through a disposable inbox, attaching the still frames and asking a simple question. "Does this look edited?" His reply came 6 hours later. One sentence: "We didn't edit that feed, but someone overlaid a layer after export." He added nothing else. I responded with a request to talk live. Silence. The next day, his LinkedIn profile vanished. His phone line gave an out-of-service tone. I received no bounce back on my message. It simply showed unread. That same night, a package arrived by courier. No signature required. Inside, a black flash drive, loosely wrapped in brown paper. No note. The file it contained was labeled Mask 07R. The video was just under 4 minutes long. Surveillance-grade quality, black and white. It showed a dressing room, generic, sterile. The subject stood in front of a mirror. His face was calm, focused. A technician applied what looked like foundation to his jawline, but as the camera zoomed slightly, the technician's fingers passed through part of the subject's cheek. Not above, not beside. Through. There was no flinch, no reaction. Then a quiet voice came from the off-screen. Female, low. "You're drifting again. Refresh your sync?" The subject nodded once. A metallic click echoed, and for less than a second, his facial structure snapped into a new alignment. Eyes narrowing, jaw tightening, pupils dilating unnaturally wide. Then, back to normal. I ran frame-by-frame analysis. 3 frames carried residual layering, as if multiple faces were being composited. The overlay wasn't post-production. It was rendered during capture. I extracted the audio and ran it through a spectrographic analysis. Hidden under the vocal bass line was a phrase, whispered in inverted phase. "The mask remembers even if you don't." The phrase repeated 3 times, then degraded into static. Forensic code embedded in the file matched a classified encoding sequence once used by NATO's projection units. The last confirmed use had been in 2005. After that, the program was supposedly mothballed, but this file had a timestamp of March 14, 2023. I shut off the lights in my workspace and sat for a long time without moving. I replayed the reflection blink in my mind again and again. The delay, the deviation, the independent eye movement. In all my years studying deception, this was something else. Not a performance, a misalignment, and if there was a mask, then somewhere beneath it was a system keeping it in place, or worse, trying to stop it from slipping. April 2003. I marked the date in my notebook, circled twice in red. The anomaly began with a televised address, not unusual in tone, but in phrasing. The subject used idioms he had never used before. A change in verbal register, sentence construction, even posture. It wasn't an evolution, it was a replacement of rhythm. At first, I thought it was an isolated shift, but when I scanned other addresses from the same time frame, the pattern repeated. 3 other global leaders displayed the same fracture. Sudden changes in speech pattern, vocabulary compression, and divergence in core ideological positioning, all within a 2-week window. One began emphasizing internal sovereignty after years of globalist policy. Another dropped decades of diplomatic vocabulary in favor of almost military bluntness. The last simply stopped smiling. I began extracting linguistic heat maps from pre- and post-April speeches. The delta was not subtle. Phrases like continuity of trust, unified reality, and strategic identity realignment appeared in multiple addresses across multiple languages. none of them standard political language. It was as if the new voices were working from the same underlying prompt. But the most disturbing shift came from a detail few others noticed. In May of that year, one of them, the same subject from my original analysis, gave an interview to a foreign press outlet. When asked about his early childhood, he paused, smiled, then referred to a school that did not exist in his documented biography. He said, "Those old schoolyards in Petranka shaped everything I became." Petranka was not listed in any registry. No such school ever existed. Worse, in an earlier interview from 2001, he described a different school, by name, in detail, a real one. I isolated the voice samples and ran a neural congruence overlay. The post-April sample lacked what vocal architects call historical arc bias, the natural echo of one's own biography and tone. When people speak about their past, their cadence shifts. Memory triggers body cues, hesitations, emotional bleed. The April voice had none. I went deeper. Hidden inside the file metadata of a televised segment from April 27th, I found a raw audio channel marked Ghost Link AOS, a backlayer embedded beneath the broadcast track. When amplified and corrected for frequency clipping, a digital voice surfaced. It repeated one phrase 6 times, almost machine-like. Node accepted. Synchronization complete. There was no trace of the voice in the master archive online, only in the studio feed. I traced a leak posted months later to a dark form archive called Yard Sync. It was crude, barely formatted, mostly numbers and time codes, but among them were phrases that mirrored my findings. A PR_2003, multi-layer insert. Successful replacement, cascades, verified alignment behavioral. 12 targets. Language convergence confirmed. The file included no names, but the timestamps matched the press footage. The signatures of drift were identical. Each node, each target, had passed through the same transition window. One section of the document read, Note: subjects must remain within projected narrative arc. Reversion to prior schema is breach condition. Observer recalibration initiated if perception exceeds threshold. At the bottom, in red text, a standalone line. If you're reading this, you are the breach. I shut the screen and checked my reflection in the window. There was nothing wrong with it. And yet, I blinked once. The reflection blinked twice. The archive came from an unsecured node on a server labeled only fracture point. I didn't find it, it found me. A system process opened on my terminal without prompt, displayed a string of diagnostic data in plain text, and then silently mounted a virtual disk. On it, one folder named in lowercase, simple and unassuming. Argo. Inside, 8 documents, all in English. 6 were text-based logs. 1 was an internal memo. The last was a redacted research report bearing the crest of an untraceable biomedical shell company. The memo was dated October 2006. Project Argo. Status briefing. Behavioral fidelity phase. I read the first page 3 times. The language was clinical, precise, but impossible to mistake. Subject replication via bioprint scaffolding has entered stable stage. Core identity overlay delivered using interpolated mnemonic pathways based on synthesized voice print emotion alignment. I stopped and stared at that sentence. Not voice modulation. Voice print emotion alignment. Whoever created these substitutes wasn't just faking appearances. They were building entities from the voice outward, seeding emotional logic through tone, like using intonation itself as a psychological instruction set. Document 3 was more explicit. Subject 4 failed emotional cascade under memory testing. Identified as non-retentive, auditory scaffolding collapsed under recursive stress input, terminated. It wasn't theoretical. There were failure logs, timestamps, vitals, test durations. Every file listed an ID. Subject numbers from 1 to 12, each corresponding to stages like baseline deposition, emotive training, media integration, speech loop stability. One subject, number 11, had a glowing report. Passed all. Speech loop injections with under 0.7% drift, gestural mimicry at 99.2%. Emotional latency acceptable within public exposure parameters. Recommended for Tier 2 deployment. Next to it, a small handwritten annotation. Deploy as public variant. Original remains archived. Archived. The original was not destroyed, not exiled, just stored. I opened the biomedical document. It was more disturbing. It detailed tissue fusion techniques, merging host structures with accelerated bioprinted clones, a process called concordant imprinting, in which the host's early memories could be transferred by mapping voice stress reactions from archived footage and inducing them in artificial hippocampal loops. I almost laughed at how absurd it sounded, until I reached the technical appendix. There, embedded in fine type, was a short paragraph explaining why they no longer used full facial duplication. Public tracking algorithms detect over-replication. Subject design now follows a similarity range of 94 to 96% to prevent recognition via side-angle drift. Direct clone models only used in non-visual administrative roles. They weren't building doubles, they were building close-enoughs, creatures that could survive scrutiny from 99% of the population, the remaining 1% tagged as observer deviants. I scrolled to the end of the last file, a compressed log entry from 3 months ago, labeled simply Field Integrity Report. The contents: Subject O, B, 11 experienced flicker event during unscripted press engagement. Public response: negligible. Audio correction patch applied retroactively. Reflection protocol updated. Observer tracking activated. Prepare recall. And below that, 3 lines, marked in red. The subject does not know it is not the original. The subject believes in the voice it carries. The public believes because it is easier than remembering otherwise. I closed the folder, checked the window again. My own face looked unchanged, but my voice, when I whispered aloud just to test it, came back to me sounding slightly different, deeper, and I wasn't sure if it was the room or something in me that had changed. The message came through an anonymous audio relay. It was short, under 20 seconds, but the voice on the other end was hoarse with fear. I was at the compound. I saw his face change when he thought no one was watching. Please stop this. They're watching the ones who remember. There was no name, no timestamp, but embedded deep in the signal was a geotag. Northern Quebec, just outside Val-d'Or. I booked a flight 2 days later under an alias I'd used only once, years ago. No checked luggage, burner phone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. The cabin was exactly where the coordinates placed it, hidden behind collapsed timber, no road access. Inside, I found him. Former security detail, early 50s, scar on his left cheek from what he later described as the moment that got me retired. His story was plain. He had served 3 years in direct proximity to one of the world's most protected men. In that time, he said, there had been moments where the face felt wrong. Not visibly, but rhythmically. Too smooth, too still. One night, during a power outage, he walked into the leader's study to inform him of emergency protocol. The room was dim. Candles flickered. He paused. The man standing there wasn't him. I mean, it looked like him, it spoke like him, but there was no breath, just playback, like watching your father talk through a screen after he's already gone. He wasn't the only one. I compiled 7 more testimonies over the next 4 weeks. A translator from Vienna who swore her voice didn't register with a replacement she'd worked with for years. A former housekeeper in Sochi who insisted that her employer's handwriting changed overnight, from warm and looping to mechanical and segmented. A childhood friend of a Balkan president who showed me 2 photos, 5 years apart, where the mole on the left cheekbone had simply vanished. I confronted him about it, he said. He laughed, then said, "Maybe you're thinking of someone else." But I wasn't. I knew his hands. I knew the way he used to clear his throat before lying. The new one didn't do that. These people were from different countries, backgrounds, languages, but their stories aligned in one uncanny detail. The replacements weren't bad copies. They were too good, seamless, almost hollow, as if they wore every right gesture, but had no interior resistance. I asked one of them, a former private pilot, what finally convinced him. He looked at me and said, "The moment I saw him walk barefoot across a marble floor without flinching. He used to hate the cold. That's when I knew." Back at my hotel, I received another message. No voice this time, just a data packet containing a filtered audio recording. I opened it cautiously. Spectral readouts spiked in unnatural intervals. The voice on the track was female, mid-range, heavily distorted. Yet the clarity of her words cut through. "You are aggregating deviations. This is your second marker. The third will not be allowed." As the voice faded, a second layer emerged underneath. A whisper, almost a thought more than a sound. "They already replaced the ones you trust. Now they're mapping the ones who notice." Then silence. I replayed it 4 times. Every time the phrase shifted slightly in pitch. Not in my system, in the file itself, as if alive, adjusting to my hearing. On the 5th replay, the final sentence was replaced. "Soon you won't remember who was who." I closed the laptop. Outside, in the parking lot, a man in a gray coat stood perfectly still under a street lamp, not blinking. He wore a smile, but the corners of his eyes didn't move. It began with the lecture, a guest seminar I had delivered at a university back in 2015, archived in full on their site, now linked to a mirror in a research consortium database. I didn't remember authorizing that upload, but the footage was real. I was there, standing under blue light, speaking about cognitive bias and voice analysis. Except it wasn't my voice. It sounded close, identical in tone, cadence, even the pauses I used to think were unique to my style. But there was something added. A sharpness at the edges, an absence of warmth. Words I didn't use. A sentence structure that leaned into clinical detachment. I played the clip twice, then 10 times. Each time, I felt a hollow expand just behind my rib cage. It wasn't me, but it wore me. I checked the metadata. The file's audio layer had been updated in 2022. The lecture was from 2015. There was no record of an edit. The second event was more difficult to quantify. I found my research notebook, the one I had filled by hand during the Oslo anomaly audit. But the ink was different. My handwriting, once tight and curved, now leaned angular, as if traced by someone copying muscle memory without the intention behind it. Page 13, which I had underlined in red pen, a note that read, "Second jaw shift confirmed," see minute 0319, was gone. In its place, The same line, but different wording. Primary modulation accepted. Archive 0319 normalized. I hadn't written that. I didn't know what it meant. That night, I recorded myself speaking. Simple sentences, repeated phrases, control samples I had used for years in acoustic testing. Then I left the recorder running and went to sleep. In the morning, the waveform had a gap. Between 3:04 and 3:07 a.m., there was no room sound. No shift of the blanket, no distant traffic, just cut silence. At 3:08, a voice resumed. Not mine. My voice, yes. But the words were wrong. Observer, latency confirmed. Integration progressing. Resistance defined as structural error. I didn't remember saying it. I played it back in Wave Editor view. The voice print matched mine within 99.2%, the same mouth, the same breath interval. But the emotional signature was sterile. My voice was responding to something. I isolated background frequencies and ran them through a hidden carrier detector, a trick I'd learned from acoustic counterintelligence cases. It revealed a nested signal, almost inaudible, embedded in subharmonics. Do not re-record. You will overwrite synchronization. I closed the laptop, felt the cold edge of panic rise in my throat. Not because I was being watched, but because something inside me, a file, a version, a copy, was starting to act without me. I opened my encrypted drive and searched for all logs labeled Observer. Nothing. Then one file surfaced, name stripped, just a line of dots in the file tree. I opened it. Inside, a plain text header. You are the version. No date, no source, just that. I looked into the mirror in my kitchen, not for answers, but to test a theory. I raised my right hand. The reflection raised its left. I blinked. The reflection didn't. Then it smiled. Just a little. Like it knew I finally understood. They brought me into the room without a word. No weapons, no restraints, just silence, as if that alone would ensure obedience. The hallways leading to it were sterile, indirect. I counted the turns, but lost track after the 12th. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead at the exact pitch of standard MRI equipment. Psychological conditioning through ambient design. The cleanroom was cold. Not medically, architecturally. A space never meant for living bodies. It had no scent. The air itself seemed artificial. At the center, a single chair, facing a wall-sized pane of glass. Behind the glass, a version of me, sitting, blinking, waiting. Not a recording, not a projection. Real. He wore my jacket from 2 years ago, the one I lost during a layover in Warsaw. His shoes were mine, right down to the frayed stitching I used to pick at when nervous. He tapped his fingers in the same rhythm I used to use while decrypting old drives. 3 beats, pause, 1 beat. Then he looked up and smiled. The room lights dimmed slightly and a soft hum filled the floor beneath my feet. Not mechanical, but resonant, as if the structure itself was reacting to proximity. A speaker clicked on above the glass. The voice that came through was my own. Do you accept the continuity? I didn't respond. He repeated it. Do you accept the continuity? Behind me, a soft mechanical noise. A drawer sliding open. Inside, a file folder labeled Observer, Trace 01, Active, Unresolved. I opened it. There were photos. Me at desks I never sat at. Me in offices I never visited. A copy of my handwriting on forms I never filled, but the signature matched. Even the pressure on the loops. Even the slant of fatigue. A report inside read, "Subject integrated into civilian data stream without breach for 1,082 days. Deviation occurred upon exposure to vocal mismatch cascade. Containment triggered. Version currently unstable." Another page, blank except one line. "This version now contains more memory than the original." I looked back at the figure behind the glass. He stood, moved forward, mimicked every gesture I made half a second after I moved. Not before, not simultaneously, as if taking cues. I reached toward the glass slowly. So did he. But when I paused, he didn't. His hand pressed to the glass. Mine did not. A moment passed. Then the lights dimmed entirely. And from the ceiling, a hidden speaker whispered, not in my voice, but in the one I heard in my sleep since the audio started glitching. "One of you is ready, the other is archival." Then a click. The door opened behind me. No one entered, but a folder slid across the floor from the darkness outside. On the cover, handwritten in ink, "Select your voice." Inside were 2 black ID cards. Both had my name. Both had my face. One had the word continuity. The other had the word ECHO. No one told me what would happen if I chose either. And the reflection behind the glass? It was no longer mirroring me at all.